So, helmets again. This time the civilian protective helmet from Britain in the Second World War, known by many people these days as a Zuckerman helmet from Solly Zuckerman, one of the designers. Britain, we've been preparing our civil defence in the later 1930s, but really after the beginning of World War II we have this period, the Phony War. But when Germany invades France-Belgium in May of 1940, that leads to a kind of supercharging of our home defence issues because the Germans capture the coastline. One of the reasons Britain has sent out the British Expeditionary Force to France is to try and stop the Germans capturing those areas along the coast, because we knew we were going to have trouble, because that would then bring German bombers well within range of London and other areas if they've got the French coastline. So even though we have been working out with civil defence, there's been issuing of gas masks, there's been building of shelters, we need more. And this brings in a number of interesting characters, one of which is Solly Zuckerman. Now, Solly Zuckerman, he was born in South Africa. He was Russian Jewish emigre family that was out there. He's educated in Britain, and he becomes a teacher at Oxford University, a don there. And he's called in, like a number of very bright people, to help the government in the war period. Now, Zuckerman, sometimes you might call him a researcher, but actually he's much more than that. At the beginning of the war, he's working with the civil defence side of things, looking at what are the effects going to be of bombing potentially on the public. We had this great fear back in the 30s. Stanley Baldwin said the bomber will always get through. You know, what's the effect on buildings? How are we going to recover from this? What's the psychological effect as well? And later in the war, one of the things Zuckerman takes some of that experience. He's also part of a group that is part of the British Bombing Survey Unit. And that group are looking at the effects of British bombing campaign. And he argues prior to D-Day for something that gets put into place called the Transportation Plan, which is that the British bombers, or there should be a bombing campaign to take out the French railway network, because that will force the Germans to use more of their automotive transport to supply troops, to get ammunition, all the equipment around the place, and they haven't got that fuel in Germany. So again, that was another one of these, join the dots type of thing that he was doing. So Zuckerman's part, and he works with a number of other great names at the ministry to try and what was called then the Ministry of Home Security. One of those names is a chap called Derman Christofferson, who's an engineer, and he's in the research department of the Ministry of Home Security. And another chap called Hugh Cairns works as part of these three of them coming together. Now, Hugh Cairns was originally born out in Australia. He becomes a neurosurgeon, and he's particularly interested in brain injuries. He's the guy that was called along to T. Lawrence's bedside when Lawrence comes off his motorbike down at near Bovington, just near Clouds Hill, where he lived. He's got this awful head injury, most of his scalp missing, and he lingers on, still alive, for 6 days before he dies. And Cairns is one of the people that's brought in, and he's quite affected by what he sees, because this seems to be an injury to him that could have been avoided. And because of his work in this area in motorcycle crashes, it means that it leads on to him becoming very influential in the introduction of crash helmets for the military, for civilian motorcycle riders, and in essence he saves thousands of lives over time because of that, because of his influence there. So Cairns, Christofferson and Zuckerman, they come together, and this is what they come up with, this design of a helmet. What's so special about it? Well, it looks very similar to the British Mark I, Mark II helmets that the forces are using, but it has got differences. It's done in mild steel, So it's relatively cheap, and mild steel is more readily available because manganese steel is going into the production of the military grade helmets. Mild steel as well, relatively easy to stamp in one operation. So again, production, they start making them at the end of 1940. They're first issued in early 41. And by the time they stopped making them in 1942, 10 million of these have been made for civil defence purposes. So there's a lot wanted out there. Therefore, that idea of simplifying production, very important. It's got a very simple liner that's held on by, there's 16 holes around the outside, bootlace taken all the way through those holes to attach the liner on the inside. They put little what's called bales inside for holding on a helmet strap, but they don't issue the helmet strap. If you want to make your own tab one, that's up to you. Again, you're not running around too much. That was the thought process. So again, if you want to put a helmet strap on this one, someone's put a leather one on it, do so, but they weren't actually issued that way. They're issued in two simple sizes, medium and large, and there's, for each of those two sizes, there's 3 basic sizes of liners, and the piece of paper that comes with the issuing of this actually has instructions on it where it says to the words to the effect of, if you can't get it to fit too well, just stuff that rim with some paper or something else, and that'll make it secure enough on your head. As I mentioned, these are issued in large quantity, fire guards or fire watchers. Another one of these bits of civil defence sometimes people overlook. You were conscripted. In other words, you had to become a fire watcher if you were of certain ages and you weren't in reserved occupations. And they took volunteers, men up to the age of 70, women up to the age of 60 as well, to be fire watchers. And the idea there, they are quite important because they're there to make sure that if there are bombing raids, or even if there's not, because things like sabotage, they worry about arsonists, etc. That sense of there's 24-hour watches on some or from some key buildings to make sure fires aren't being started and we can deal with them as quickly as possible. So not only are you a watcher, but actually quite often you might be part of that team that's going to try and initially put out things like incendiary bombs as well. These are issued there. Sometimes, they were mainly painted in grey, but you'll see them then repainted white, depending on the roles, and sometimes with stencils across the front. So SFP, Street Fire Party, or again, these were sometimes, again, just FP or for Fire Party that way, or FG, Fire Guard. It would sometimes be put on the front there. And sometimes you'll see black bands as well painted, and that was, whether you were a street area, whatever it is, sort of supervisor, then you were given almost like ranks on some of that as well. This particular one, it's got a punch little symbol on the front there, which means it's made by the Press Steel Company, an M for medium. It's dated there as 1941 as well. And there's a little approval stamp there as well, punched on it. The lacing that goes round it is actually angled, and it's angled downwards towards the front, whether people actually recognise that. But it does say it in the instruction pamphlet that was given. And that's so it supposedly sits on the head at the right angle. The important thing about it that was put in there, it's taller, it's higher than the standard Mark I or Mark II British service helmet. And that was purposely designed, Ken's involved here, because you've got a crush area or a crumple area above your actual head. And the thought processes behind that was that, of course, if you are outside and you've got falling masonry, all sorts of bits and pieces could be going on, that will give you a better level of protection, especially as it's not that thick a steel than if it was just straight next to your head that way. So, again, all part of that design process into a helmet that, as I said, 10 million made by 1942, which is why they turn up in large quantities, 3 of them here, people's back garden sheds, they were put away. You could buy one. They were actually issued. There's arguments going on at the press, who should get one for free, who should pay for it. You know, not just via that, factory workers, nighttime air raids, whatever. So you could buy one of these for 5 shillings and 6pence. So they, you know, there was lots of them around, and that, as I say, is why they still come up now. Sometimes some of us might have sneered a bit, overlooked a bit. Look, there's that bigger history behind it with some really great names. So perhaps, you know, again, with all these things, look at that level of interest at something like this, that, you know, what it can reveal. Again, every object, there's a story behind it. Thank you. Right, mate.